we talked about morph targets, we talked about the morph brush, we talked about layers. So just the next thing to talk about the way I use the brushes in terms of strokes and how you can use those with VDMs to get slightly different effects. Thinking a little bit outside the box about just the way that you use the tools. We'll just dive in. We have our geometry here. I'm actually going to go, I think I'm going to go to this head because it's not got so many layers, and that's great. Record mode. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to, so we just call this new, and that's because it's a new sculpt. So on this layer we don't have anything associated, and we have this brush that's called the standard brush. This really is the kind of main go-to brush that I use, and it just typically, when you start up ZBrush, I'm just sliding this over. I just get this. I'll type in 25 because it's not playing ball. Right. In general, the brushes are at kind of a default mean size, which is about 25. Well, that's referring to intensity. What that means is, and this is the same with pretty much every brush. I change the intensity, but when you start up and initiate them, they're all approximately around 25. Some of the clay brushes are set at 50. That's just a default state. So really, when you use the brush, you see something. So this is generally at 50. And what I mean see something, so that when some artist comes along and just pressing the X key and you see that kind of round puck, that's kind of like giving you a very obvious effect on the surface of the model. And the clay brush is a brush I use a lot, and as you can guess, the clue is in the name. It's been designed to have the appearance of clay, of digital clay, and kind of behaves in a very similar way. So let's just undo that. So the clay brush is this really is standard ZBrush fare. There's really nothing to see here, and we got the standard brush. Right, so not terribly exciting at the moment. We can hit the S key, and what that does is we have the slider to change the intensity here. So I'm dragging with my Wacom tablet. You're holding down. If I remove the tablet, I'm using the mouse, and I just simply click on this little slider, and this affects the intensity. We can add adds to the surface. Z sub, I'm just clicking, left mouse click, cuts in. Just undo those. You have kind of like a default state. I tend to favor leaving in the sub mode, and then because I tend to find I'm often cutting in when I'm doing surface detail. There's no hard and fast rule, but regardless of the state, what you can do so that you can use this, I use the term on the fly, so I don't have to keep on going back up here and touching this. You can drag out, and that's sub, and then I press the Alt key, and that adds up. That pushes the modeling surface out. It depends what feels natural to you. Some people would prefer that they're adding and then pressing the Alt key and removing. And this, as I said, this is nothing exciting. This is very much standard ZBrush fare. Right, I'm putting this back into record mode because it's stepped back to that level. So we have cutting in, cutting out, add, see add, Alt, cut in, U gives us this user interface. On the fly, we can change the intensity, speeds it up a bit. We have a draw size, which I'm going to show first. As I slide that up and down, we can see that the puck is kind of like increasing in size. And one of the most common things that I do is I've hit the S key, and now I can change this on the fly. So I can make this big. I can take it down to something very, very tiny and refined, so we get much tighter detail. and so on. So S key, change the size, U, changes intensity, Alt, inverts the standard state, and we can change these to a default state if we so desire. Focal shift, so let's add something nice and obvious like this skin hatch texture, which doesn't have much of a fall off, and let's see what happens. So let's just go for it. So now we have this stair stepping, which is kind of a nice texture. This is using our DMFX alphas, so we have that, and we can work with this. That's adding to the surface, and as I press down on the Wacom tablet, it's increasing the effect, so you can get nice subtle effects with this. I'm pressing the Alt key, I can cut in, but what we have is we have what's called the dot stroke, and then we have this stroke which is called freehand. But I'm remiss. The focal shift is something I very rarely use. Now if you look, and the shortcut key for that is, I believe it's O, because I very rarely ever use it. So if you look at the center of the puck, that's kind of changing almost the drop off of the brush. Let's tune that up to something. And that could be something if you have a problem alpha, or you need to manipulate the sort of like the fall off. That's something that can be useful. It's something that I never ever use. I very rarely change that. I think that I associate that personally more with if I was doing some kind of mechanical sculpture. I just don't touch it. So just something to be aware of. Shortcut key, O, don't use it, so I don't really go there. So my go-to is the S key, scale, intensity. So let's have a look at these strokes. We have this drag rect, which is kind of like a stamp. So instead of, let's get a pristine area of the, so this is adding, and we drag it, and I'm turning and revolving it. Let's have a look at the keyboard sort of shortcuts for that. So I am left mouse clicking and I'm dragging out, and so it's adding. Let's make that nice and obvious. It's a bit crazy. And then I'm going to press Alt, drag, and I can revolve and stamp in. Very severe, would never really do something like this, I don't think, for, you know, could be some weird alien or something, but that's the effect. So the drag rect stroke, literally as the name implies, drags it out. I'm left mouse clicking and I can revolve this and position it. When I let go, left click, it's kind of stuck in that position. And obviously on the fly we can change the scale of it, S key, and then we got U, and we can change the intensity to something a lot more subtle. I'm inverting the stroke, and so that's something that will speed up your workflow. Then something that I use a lot, colored spray, speaks for itself. We have two colors here, and that will use a spray. We'll probably do something on painting later, but let's just look at spray, because this is another one that I use a lot. We have spray set, and we're going to come to the forehead, and we're going to increase the draw size. So I press the S key, and I'm going to make this hopefully a little bit more subtle, and I'm going to put this into sub so that I'm cutting in, because that's the kind of texture I want to create. That's a bit crazy, but tuning it down, or you can hit the U key, it's up to you. So we can paint, let's take it out of X, which is symmetry, so we can have an asymmetrical finish, which is obviously useful for something like the nose or the bridge of the head. And this is just a way we can paint in texture. This is all standard fare. I'm going to kill that all. I'm going to get rid of it, and I'm just going to add a new record layer. Normally I'd give it a name. Let's keep moving forward. We've got these controls and the ZAD, sub, intensity. We've got the draw size, focal shift, which I rarely use. we've got an alpha associated. We can change that alpha to whatever we like, and we can kind of paint a subtle texture over the surface, and we get this sort of broken up, very rough skin effect. What else have we got? Let's take a look at a Vdm Brush. What we're going to do is we're just going to, this is the default state, is the drag rect. Again, I'm dragging out, left mouse clicking, and then I'm just letting go, and that's the position of it. We're quite familiar now with the concept of using the morph brush, but notice I am removing that fine texture. So the way to work with that would be to, if you wanted to do an overall texture effect over the whole surface of the skin, you'd record that on one layer here. Then your wounds, I would probably switch that off, and then what I would do is I would put a wound. Right. Okay, so we have this in record mode. Let's just make sure, yes, we have the texture on the other side. So let's go into record mode here. Right, but let's switch that off. This is kind of like a funny little feature. You have to be a little bit careful. Now we have this record mode, we have the other layers switched off. We can drag out the wound, use our trusty morph brush to alter this wound. Let's say that's the result we want. We switch out of remote record mode, and what we have is the option to have the skin on a separate layer. We can dial down that effect on one layer, and vice versa. We can change the layer order as well, and we can also do something which I failed to mention. We can duplicate layers. So something we can do is we can take this layer which has got this scar on, I'd give it a name normally, we can duplicate the layer and it kind of doubles up the effect if I didn't mention that, and we can make this into the negatives. This is all the kind of behavior that we discussed and sort of was mentioned in other kind of chapters about layers. So we've got the layers working for us. We're going to add another layer in record mode, and we're just going to look at the brush strokes. We're just going to take one of these kind of zombie strokes because they're kind of cool, and we can let's look at something that's going to be recognizable. So again, as we've had before, we don't have to use this in this way. We don't have to constantly use this tool in its default state. We can press the Alt key and push it out, and then do things like smooth that down to create other kinds of effects, and then work over the top of that. So that's other behavior. We don't have to follow a rule with this. That's what I'm trying to get through. Besides that, we could take the draw stroke, turn it into a freehand stroke. This will require a little bit of experimentation, but I know that this isn't going to have the effect that I'm really looking for. It's kind of like a single, it's kind of damaging the surface and just tearing it up. So what's another way we can use this brush? Well, inside, let me find it, it's stroke. So there is a feature called lazy mouse, and what this does is kind of, it steadies your stroke. You can see, I think if I have the lazy radius and turn it up, you see this is kind of like, it's kind of attaching itself, and it's kind of interpolating between the first point and steadying the stroke. So we've got something interesting going there, but it's this lazy step, and this is something that I use quite a lot. So we drag out, I'm just going to decrease the lazy radius because I don't really need it that high. So now we've got this interesting effect going. I mean, this is something that, like, for not just like a zombie type character, but for like aliens and creatures, where you can really start getting some really quite unusual effects going. So I'm just going to wait for ZBrush to catch up, and let's take another look. I'm going to clear that because this is going to become more apparent, because that's a bit busy. Okay, and one more. So we have our freehand stroke. We've altered the lazy mouse step, which is the distance of the stamps, and we just draw out and we get this kind of strange alien divot. Changing the scale, inverting, and it's quite fast. And already, I mean, that's, if I was trying to sculpt that on this kind of weird alien skin, which is what it's turning into, that would take me quite a while to get this effect. That's quite a lot of work done very fast. My go-to tools are lazy step and the lazy radius and lazy smooth sometimes, if I want to just, you know, steady out the stroke and change the sort of like the canter and handle, the attack of the tool. Outside you can start to actually get some very unusual effects with this, because the intent of that is to actually be a cheekbone. But let's keep moving forward, and let's get that and yet another layer. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, you want to put a wound on this piece of geometry. It's quite thin. What can happen? I don't know whether this will happen. We're just going to have to do it. I'm going to take that out of lazy mouse, and I'm going to change it back to the drag rect standard stroke, and I'm going to drag out. It's doing a little bit. Press escape. Right, let's just do that again. A nose as well. I'll try it on a, maybe I need something more severe. Let's try this on an ear. Okay. In effect, it's projecting the displacement, because this works on vectors. So it isn't like a, let's go back to the standard brush. We've got standard. Where's the standard brush? Here. Right, and I have this. Let's just do freehand stroke and get something nice and obvious like this. So hit the S key, make it smaller, and we're just dragging over the surface. And I'm just going to change the lazy step a little bit. Let's see what that does. Yeah, that's it. And that gives us a nice gritty zombie or creature, like a elephant skin, something quite severe. So that's just that stroke. But what's happening is, even if I increase this to something quite extreme, the alpha more or less pushes out. If we imagine an arrow sticking out, and it just pulls out that geometry and just pushes it out in a single direction, to when we see the puck, the round circle, hugging and conforming to the face of the normals of the geometry, it's just pulling it out. If I press Alt, it's just pushing it in. With the vector displacement map, it can push out and around a corner, because it's determining a vector in space. But what can happen sometimes, if you have a thin piece of geometry, with all of these brushes as well, it can happen, is that you can kind of destroy the back side of it. It kind of almost tears in and has a negative effect on the rear side of it. It can happen on noses as well. See if I can get it to work on a nose. I'm using the zombie ones because they are quite extreme, and this one's extreme for something that's deep. Not sure good. Let's see if it happens. Okay, normally that happens, and it hasn't. Let's see. Okay, you're kind of getting like this slippage, and this is particularly noticeable on things like fingers. I will demo that maybe on just a video where I just demo it. It cuts through and you get this weird sort of crazing. So what should happen, and Now we've gone all this way. I do hope it works, because it's one of the only things I find that cures it is you've got in here a feature. So what I've done is I've gone to the brush. So this is the brush menu, because this is considered as one kind of, all these are subtools in one giant brush. But what I'm doing here now for this drag rect stroke and this VDM is I'm putting on something called back face mask. Now hopefully as I drag out, it has worked, right? But there is still some cleanup to do there, but it's done a better job at, let's just press Control Z, undo. But the fact of the matter is I have a piece of a displacement that is deeper than the ear. Do you see what I mean? So it's going to displace through to the rear of it, but it's done a better job in keeping the ear pristine. And then I just go in with my morph brush and I just clean that up. So that's just something to be aware of, is back face masking. And you can just, because we set a mouth target, the beauty is we can, any discrepancies, we can quickly paint this out and start again and do our work, and we haven't damaged anything. If this was severe and we were chopping out an ear, then we would probably go to removing the ear, dynameshing it, and that sort of thing. And you know, there's a lot that can be achieved with that. But the thing to take away from that is that if you have a brush stroke with a VDM, you don't necessarily have to follow just the drag rect. You also have other things, like you don't necessarily have to keep this at the set intensity. If you want something more subtle on the fly, I mean, this gives you a very different effect to this, without necessarily having to go to the trouble of putting it on a layer. And so you know your own mind, you know what you like, and so you go in and go, well, I want this effect, and I'm actually going to really dial it down and actually really use it as a surface texture. You've got all the fidelity there. Then you've got your morph brush, paint into it, and you know, changing the intensity of that, something quite subtle. You already get some really nice effects just by using all the tools. Setting a morph target, we are adding layers in a proper working environment. We're giving the layers names, naming them nicely, and we're remembering that at times, if we want to set an overall texture, we need to switch that layer off and then add broad texture on another layer, and it will still show through, and we can change the layer order, double them up, delete them, copy them. And the bake all is kind of like, as I said, this can be quite processor intensive. If you've got this, you want to take, if you bake all, you want to take that out of record mode. Something to take from all this, when all this talk of brushes and strokes, is that you can use the VDMs and the alphas in sort of non-set ways. You don't necessarily have to take a VDM and use it in its kind of default state. So we've looked at the VDMs, we've looked at alphas, we've looked at strokes and some of the basic controls for getting different effects with the brushes. We've looked at layers. We've kind of discussed the fact that layers, it's useful to do things like put broader modeling for your digital prosthetics on one layer and then textures on another. We've looked at how we use the morph brush. We've looked at how the sliders affect the modeling and how we can invert and push things backwards and forwards. It's important that you record on specific layers so that you don't get mixed up, so that you don't put fine detail on one layer and then broader sculpture on another. You can move layers up and down by pressing this button. You can duplicate a layer and you can delete a layer. And then the bake all, something to remember is to not leave it in record mode, because it does kind of strange things if you've got poly paint. And we haven't talked about poly painting, but that's something that we'll get into a little bit. But at the moment, we're just looking at the VDMs in terms of just modeling. So the layers are useful. always set them off target for my money, and there you go. You can do a lot more with DMFX than just what we've done here. This is just real demo stuff, and you can really dive in and really get under the hood and get some really nice textures going and take advantage of like that sort of prosthetic makeup artist experience and get some really nice designs going. Okay, thanks.